She was floating in the pool, softly singing to herself, unaware of the world, until the millionaire stepped into the water, his eyes locked on her. In that moment, her song stopped, but her heart began to race. Watch till the end to see what happens when the millionaire steps into the pool with her. Charles Grayson had been staring at spreadsheets for hours. The boardroom was filled with polished suits, expensive watches, and shallow conversations about numbers. Every voice sounded the same to him, hollow, predictable. His mind wasn't in the meeting anymore. It was already drifting somewhere quieter. By 11:45 a.m., he had made up his mind. He closed his leather folder with a snap, startling the man beside him. "Cancel the rest of my schedule," he told his assistant, his voice deep but tired. Without waiting for an answer, he walked out, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors. The drive home was smooth, his black luxury car gliding through the streets. He loosened his tie, rolling down the window to feel the warm air against his face. It was one of those days where all a man wanted was peace. The kind that only existed beside the still water of his private pool. As the mansion came into view, the tall iron gates slid open for him. The driveway was lined with perfect green hedges and roses in bloom, but today he barely noticed them. He pulled into his spot, cut the engine, and stepped out into the silence. Or at least, he thought it was silence. At first, it was faint, almost easy to miss. A sound that didn't belong. The soft, rhythmic splash of water. Charles paused, narrowing his eyes. He didn't have any staff scheduled for today. No one should be here. He reached into his pocket, ready to press the button for security. But then he heard it. A voice. It wasn't just speaking, it was singing. Not loud, not professional, but pure. A sweetness that tugged at something buried deep inside him. It was the kind of voice that could make you forget where you were for a moment. His steps slowed as he followed the sound. Through the open patio doors, warm light spilled onto the floor. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, the flowers that climbed along the pool fence. And then he saw her. In the shimmering blue water of his private pool was a woman. She was completely naked. Her skin glowed under the sun, smooth and pale, drops of water tracing down her shoulders. Her hair, a golden wet cascade, clung to her neck and back. She wasn't just swimming. She was moving slowly, gracefully, as though the water was her safe place. Her lips parted with each note, and her eyes were closed as if the world outside didn't exist. For a man like Charles, used to control and order, this sight was unsettling. Unsettling and yet impossible to turn away from. His breath caught without warning. He should have shouted, demanded to know who she was. But something in her voice, aching, almost fragile, stopped him. The song drifted through the warm afternoon air, curling around his heart. Every note sounded like it carried a story he didn't know yet. Every movement in the water seemed to belong to a dream. He stood there in the doorway, perfectly still, as though afraid to break the moment. The sunlight sparkled across the ripples she made, casting golden patterns on the white stone around the pool. Then, without warning, she turned her head. Her eyes opened. Blue, clear, wide with shock. Her song died mid-note. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other, the billionaire and the stranger in his pool. Charles felt his pulse in his throat. The question in his mind wasn't, "Who are you?" It was something far stranger. "Why do I feel like I've seen you before?" The water stilled around her as she froze under his gaze. Her cheeks flushed pink, and her arms instinctively crossed over her chest, though the water hid most of her. And that was when Charles realized this was not going to be an ordinary afternoon. For a few seconds longer, Charles remained perfectly still in the shadow of the doorway. From there, he could see everything, the curve of her shoulder as it rose from the water, the way the sunlight kissed each droplet sliding down her skin. Her voice wrapped around him like warm silk, pulling him closer without a single step. It wasn't a polished voice. It didn't sound like someone who'd trained for years in a music academy. It was something better and something raw. Alive. Every note was dipped in truth, in unspoken emotions. He found himself leaning slightly forward, caught between wanting to keep watching and the nagging thought that this was, without question, his property. She had no right to be here, and yet the idea of ending this moment felt wrong. but moments have a way of ending on their own. She turned. Her movement sent a ripple through the pool, the water catching the sunlight and scattering it across her skin like diamonds. Her eyes, the clearest blue he had ever seen, found his, and for an instant she froze. The singing stopped. Her lips parted in surprise. Then came the small, startled gasp. It was the sound of someone caught in a secret they never meant to share. Without thinking, she dipped lower in the water, crossing her arms over her chest, her hair falling forward to shield her face. But her eyes, those wide, luminous eyes, never left his. Charles stepped forward into the light. "What are you doing in my pool?" His voice was calm, but it carried a depth that left no room for pretending this wasn't serious. The warmth of the afternoon seemed to shift. The air between them was now heavy with a tension neither of them could name. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling like the ripples in the water. "I'm Nora Schuyler. I clean houses in this area. Your housekeeper. She lets me swim sometimes after work. Today she wasn't here, but—" She trailed off, her breath uneven. "But you decided to trespass?" His question was sharp, but not cruel. It was the tone of a man who wanted the truth, not excuses. Her gaze dropped to the water as if she could hide there. "I just needed to feel free for a moment." Those words landed differently than he expected. Something about the way she said free made his chest tighten. She didn't say it like a spoiled child caught breaking the rules. She said it like someone who hadn't known freedom in a very long time. Charles studied her silently, every instinct telling him to send her away. And yet there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Who was this woman who dared to slip into his world uninvited? And why did she look both fragile and unafraid at the same time? The water shimmered between them, a barrier that felt paper-thin. He couldn't ignore the truth. Her presence was already unsettling his carefully ordered life. And for the first time in years, he didn't hate the feeling. Charles didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her. Really looked at her, as if trying to decide whether she was real or just something his restless mind had conjured in the heat of the afternoon. The air between them was thick, almost humming, and the water's gentle ripples were the only sound. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the cuffs of his shirt. Slowly, deliberately, he unfastened them. Nora's brows drew together, her body instinctively pressing further against the pool's edge. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight but curious. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid his jacket from his broad shoulders and tossed it onto the nearest chair. It landed with a soft thud, a whisper against the tension building in the air. Next came his shirt buttons. One by one, his fingers worked them open, revealing the hard lines of a man who didn't just live in boardrooms, but knew the discipline of control in every aspect of life. Her eyes followed the movement without meaning to, and when the last button was undone, he shrugged it off. The sunlight caught the shape of him. The smooth planes of his chest, the taut muscle beneath skin that had seen both luxury and labor. Nora swallowed. She didn't understand why her pulse was racing. This was the owner of the house, a man she had trespassed against, and yet he was stepping closer, not away. Then, without hesitation, he moved to the pool's edge and stepped in, fully clothed from the waist down. The water welcomed him with a quiet splash, his tall frame cutting through the surface effortlessly. The shock of the moment made her eyes widen. "Are you serious?" she breathed, her voice barely louder than the ripple of water around them. "If you're going to steal my pool," he said, his tone carrying the faintest smirk, "I should at least join you." Something about his voice, confident, smooth, with an edge she couldn't read, made her heart pound harder. The water between them felt different now. It wasn't just hers anymore. It was theirs. She instinctively drifted toward the far end, keeping the distance between them. She didn't know what game he was playing, if it was a test, a punishment, or something entirely different. Charles began moving toward her, his strokes slow, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world to close the gap. His eyes never left hers, a steady, piercing blue that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "I don't bite," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The corners of his mouth curved, but it wasn't a full smile. It was something far more dangerous. The kind of expression that told her he was used to getting answers, used to people folding under the weight of his gaze. Nora's breath caught, and though she told herself to stay calm, she could feel her fingers curling tighter around the pool's edge. The warmth of the water was nothing compared to the heat in her chest. Every step he took forward in the water made the space between them feel smaller, charged. It was like the air itself had thickened, and each second seemed to stretch longer than it should. For a man who could have demanded she leave, he was taking his time. And for a woman who could have tried to swim away, she was rooted in place, caught in something she couldn't quite name. The pool no longer felt like an escape. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous, and she wasn't sure she wanted it to end. The water cradled them in a silence that felt heavier than words. They floated just a few feet apart, but it was close enough for Charles to notice the tiny movements of her breathing, the way her chest rose and fell just a touch faster than normal. She was trembling, not because the water was cold, it was warm, almost comforting, but because of him. He could see it in her eyes, the way they shifted between meeting his gaze and darting away. Charles tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were a puzzle with missing pieces. His voice came low, calm, yet with a weight that demanded truth. "Why here? Why today?" For a moment, she said nothing. Her lips parted, but no words came. The sunlight caught the faintest shimmer in her eyes, as if she was holding back something fragile, something she didn't want to hand over to a stranger. Finally, her voice emerged, soft, almost hesitant. "Because when I'm in the water—" She paused, her gaze drifting to the ripples moving between them. "I'm not a maid. I'm not broke. I'm not invisible. I'm just me." The confession hung in the air, quiet but powerful. Charles felt it. It wasn't self-pity in her tone, it was something deeper, a quiet exhaustion. A lifetime of being overlooked, of being seen only for the work she did, never for the person she was. He didn't speak right away. He let the words settle, as if tasting them, letting them echo in his mind. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, Charles closed the remaining space between them. The water shifted around them with a faint, soothing sound. Beneath the surface, he reached for her hand. Nora stiffened in surprise at the sudden touch, her eyes flicking to his face as though to search for mockery. But there was none. His grip was steady, warm even through the water, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. "You're not invisible to me now," he said. The words were low, almost a whisper, but they landed like a promise. Her breath caught, and she stared at him, trying to decide if he meant it. If this was just some game to him, or something else entirely. No one had ever said those words to her before. Not once. Her lips trembled slightly, and she looked away, as if afraid that holding his gaze too long might make her believe him too quickly. But she didn't pull her hand back. Charles didn't let go either. He held it there, under the water, as though anchoring her to the moment, telling her without saying it that she wasn't drifting alone anymore. The sound of the world beyond the pool seemed far away now. There was only the quiet lapping of water, the heat between them, and the unspoken truth that something had shifted. It wasn't just about a trespasser and a billionaire anymore. It was about two people who, for reasons neither fully understood yet, could no longer pretend the other didn't matter. They began to move through the water together, at first without speaking. It was a slow, unhurried rhythm, almost like a dance. Two people circling each other, learning the other's movements without ever touching. The mansion, the driveway, the outside world, it all seemed far away now. The water was their whole universe. Charles swam a slow lap, his strokes smooth, but his eyes kept flicking toward Nora. She moved like someone who belonged in the water, graceful yet unself-conscious. Every turn, every flick of her foot under the surface felt effortless. When she dove under, disappearing in a trail of silver bubbles, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity mixed with admiration. She emerged at the far end, flipping her hair back with a sweep of her hand, water cascading down her shoulders. "Like this," she called, smiling for the first time since he had seen her. Then she dove again, twisting under the surface in a tight, fluid spin. Charles, without thinking, tried to mimic her move. But instead of her graceful twist, he ended up awkwardly turning halfway and coming up in a splash. It was then that he heard it, a laugh. Not polite, not forced, but a real unrestrained laugh, light and soft, yet filling the air between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. She covered her mouth instinctively, as if she shouldn't be laughing at him, but her eyes sparkled, betraying the joy she couldn't hide. And something inside him shifted. Charles found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. It wasn't the kind of smile he wore in boardrooms, the tight, calculated one. This was different. This was the kind that made his chest feel lighter. He swam toward her again, slower this time, their laughter still hanging between them like a fragile thread. Every second they shared in that pool stripped away the formality, the boundaries that had existed when he first stepped onto the patio. The more he watched her, the more he realized he didn't care how they had met. He didn't care that she had trespassed, or that she wasn't part of his carefully managed world. All he knew was that he didn't want this moment, this feeling, to end. The hours passed without them noticing. The shadows stretched longer across the water, and the sun began to dip low, turning the evening light into a warm golden haze. They drifted toward the shallow end, standing now, their feet brushing the tiled floor beneath the water. The distance between them had shrunk without either of them deciding it should. They were close enough that their breaths mingled, close enough that the smallest movement could bring them even closer. The golden light wrapped around them, softening every edge, making the world look almost unreal. Charles's voice broke the silence, low, almost as if he was afraid to disturb the magic that had formed. "I could get used to this," he murmured. Her eyes searched his for a moment, and there was no hesitation when she replied. "So could I," she whispered. Something unspoken passed between them then. A quiet agreement, a shared recognition that whatever had started as an intrusion had now turned into something neither of them could have predicted, and neither wanted to lose. That night, after the sun had sunk completely beyond the horizon, they didn't leave the pool right away. Instead, they sat side by side on the edge, wrapped in large white towels that smelled faintly of fresh linen. The air was cooler now, but neither of them seemed to notice. Their conversation kept them warm. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about the small town she grew up in, the diner where she worked before coming to the city, and how her parents had taught her to swim in a lake when she was little. He told her about his first business deal, how lonely success had been at the top, and the constant pressure to be the man everyone expected. At some point, Charles realized he wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't thinking about emails, meetings, or stock reports. The world beyond the two of them simply didn't matter. When the sky turned completely dark and the stars began to scatter across the heavens, they still stayed there, voices low, as if afraid to wake the night. Something unspoken had begun to root itself between them. Days passed, but the memory of that first evening wouldn't leave either of them. So when Charles called her a few days later, his voice softer than usual, and said, "Come back, not as a trespasser, as my guest," she didn't hesitate. And that was how it began. She returned, and not just once. The pool became their meeting place, their quiet escape. Some days they swam, other days they simply floated under the sun talking. Each time, the line between billionaire and maid blurred a little more, replaced by something simpler, man and woman, learning each other's worlds. Charles began to notice small things. The way she bit her lip when she was thinking. The way her laughter always started in her eyes before reaching her lips. How she never asked him for anything, except his time. And Nora began to see sides of him no one else did. How his voice softened when he was talking about something he truly cared about. How his smile was rare but honest. How, despite all his money, he still carried the quiet ache of someone who'd been lonely too long. Then came one quiet evening when the pool reflected the stars so perfectly it felt like they were swimming through the night sky itself. The air was still, the world hushed, and they stood in the shallow end, the water rippling softly around them. Charles reached for her, his hands finding her face with a tenderness that caught her breath. His thumbs brushed along her jaw, his eyes holding hers as if nothing else existed. "Nora," he said, his voice low but steady, "I've spent my life swimming in money, but you're the first person who made me feel alive." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her heart was pounding, and she felt the sting of tears she didn't want to let fall. She had never been someone's first anything before. So instead of words, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, unhurried, the kind of kiss that didn't need to prove anything. The water moved gently around them, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. It was more than a kiss. It was the quiet sealing of something precious. In that moment, the girl who had once been a trespasser was now something else entirely. She was his treasure. And maybe, just maybe, the lesson was this: that worth is never found in bank accounts or gated mansions. It's found in the moments when two people see each other for who they truly are and choose to stay. True love isn't bound by money, class, or appearances. It's about kindness, respect, and standing by someone when they feel most vulnerable. In a world where people are often judged by what they have, real happiness comes when we see each other's hearts, not our bank accounts or social status.